The moment Karoline Leavitt stepped onto the plane, a wave of relief washed over her. After a long day filled with briefings, press calls, and the nonstop demands of Washington, D.C., she was finally heading home to Manchester, New Hampshire. As the youngest White House press secretary, every day was a battle against the media, but for the next few days, she could just be Karoline, the small-town girl who once scooped ice cream at her family's shop. She adjusted her carry-on and made her way through the crowded aisle, the familiar scent of coffee mixing with the sterile tang of airplane upholstery. Every row was packed, passengers already settling in, flipping through magazines or scrolling through their phones. First class wasn't a luxury for her, it was a necessity with the constant travel that came with her role. The extra space and quiet were a brief escape before diving back into the chaos of politics. As she reached her seat and tucked her bag away, her attention shifted to an elderly man making his way slowly down the aisle. He must have been in his late 80s, moving with deliberate steps, gripping each seat for balance. His worn jacket hung loosely over his frail frame, but what stood out most was the cap on his head, World War II veteran, something not just bought in a store, but earned through sacrifice. As he carefully maneuvered through the narrow space, most passengers remained oblivious, too absorbed in their own worlds to notice. But Karoline saw something deeper, exhaustion, not just from age, but from a lifetime of carrying unseen burdens. The flight attendant guided him to his assigned seat, 26B, wedged in the middle of the economy section. Karoline glanced at the tight row and, in that moment, knew exactly what she had to do. The lack of legroom, the long journey ahead, something about it just didn't sit right. Karoline stood up, stepping into the aisle. "Sir," she said gently. The old man looked up, slightly startled, his aged but wise eyes meeting hers. She hesitated for only a moment before gesturing toward her seat. "I'd be honored if you took my spot up here." A beat of silence stretched between them as the veteran blinked, clearly surprised. "Oh no, I couldn't possibly," he murmured. "Please," she insisted, her voice both soft and firm. "You've already done so much for this country, let me do this for you." The flight attendant, overhearing their conversation, stepped in. "That's very kind of you, Miss Leavitt." By now, other passengers had started to notice. A businessman 2 rows back paused from checking his emails. A young woman pulled down her headphones. A middle-aged couple exchanged knowing glances. The veteran let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. "Well, if you insist, but only if you let me buy you a coffee when we land." Karoline smiled. "Deal." The flight attendant helped the man into her first-class seat while she gathered her bag. As she walked toward the back of the plane, she could feel eyes following her. But she hadn't done it for attention, hadn't done it for a story, it just felt right. She slipped into seat 26B, wedged between 2 passengers, completely unaware that what she had just set in motion would become a national story. And before the flight even landed, something unbelievable was about to happen. Just as she was settling in, the man beside her, a middle-aged passenger in a wrinkled button-down, leaned in slightly, his voice low and conspiratorial. "You know who that is, right?" Karoline turned to him, caught off guard. "Excuse me?" He nodded toward first class, where the veteran was now adjusting his reclined seat, his aged hands gripping the armrests as if they carried more than just his weight. "That guy," the man muttered. "That's not just any veteran. That's Joseph Monroe." The name meant nothing to her, but the way he said it made her stomach tighten. "I don't." "Who is he?" she asked. The man let out a quiet, almost amused huff. "Of course you wouldn't know," he said. "They don't talk about guys like him much anymore." Something about the way he said guys like him felt loaded, not in a malicious way, but as if he knew something she didn't. "He was in the 82nd Airborne during World War II," the man continued. "Paratrooper. But after the war, let's just say he got caught up in things." A prickle of unease crept along the back of Karoline's neck. "What kind of things?" she asked. The man's eyes flicked around, as if checking for eavesdroppers. "CIA Black Ops. The kind of missions that don't officially exist." Then, back in the 70s, he disappeared. Just vanished. Some say he was involved in something big, something the government wanted buried. Karoline's instinct was to brush it off as another conspiracy theory. She had spent enough time in Washington to know how easily half-truths turned into dramatic stories. But something about the man's tone, the certainty in it, made her pause. And then, as if on cue, Joseph Monroe turned his head and looked straight at her. She felt it before she saw it, that subtle, heavy awareness of being watched. His gaze wasn't unkind, but it was piercing, studying her as if he knew exactly what she was hearing. A slow, deliberate nod, not of gratitude, not of simple acknowledgement. Something else. Karoline swallowed. The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted. It was subtle at first, the way people glanced at her, a couple of whispers, fleeting looks in her direction. Then the flight attendant returned, smiling warmly as she handed Monroe a drink, but her eyes flicked toward Karoline for just a second too long. And then came the man in 24A. Seated 2 rows ahead, he twisted slightly in his seat, not enough to be obvious, but just enough to steal a glance toward first class. Just enough to glance at Monroe. Unlike the others, he wasn't whispering to a seatmate or scrolling on his phone. He was watching. Focused. Too focused. Karoline felt her stomach tighten again. Was this just paranoia? Was she reading too much into a harmless situation? Or had she just stepped into something much bigger than she realized? The overhead speakers crackled, and the captain's voice came through, announcing their cruising altitude and estimated arrival time. Karoline forced herself to relax. She had been in politics long enough to know how easily people got swept up in rumors. And yet, Monroe's look, the way the man beside her had spoken his name, the subtle but deliberate glances from 24A, it all felt off. This wasn't just about an old man getting an upgrade to first class. Before she could think further, the pilot's voice returned, this time with an edge of concern. The intercom static lingered a second too long before the announcement. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We're experiencing an unexpected systems check from air traffic control. Nothing to be concerned about, but we'll be in a holding pattern for the next 20 minutes. Flight attendants, please remain in position. Karoline sat up straighter. Holding patterns weren't unusual, but something about the phrasing felt wrong. The man beside her let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. Yeah, that's not normal. She turned to him. What do you mean? He nodded toward the window. Mid-flight, no turbulence, no airspace congestion. A system check from air traffic control at this altitude? That's just vague enough to mean nothing and everything. Karoline clenched her jaw. Maybe this was just a coincidence. Maybe she was overthinking things. But then, from first class, Joseph Monroe turned his head again, this time locking eyes with her. Intentionally. That was all it took. Karoline unbuckled her seatbelt and stood. The man beside her glanced up, surprised. Where are you going? To get some answers. She walked up the aisle, ignoring the subtle glances from other passengers. Her heartbeat quickened as she reached Monroe's row. He saw her coming and, without hesitation, gestured for her to take the empty seat beside him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then he let out a slow breath. You didn't have to give up your seat for me. Karoline shook her head. It was the right thing to do. Monroe studied her. Up close, she saw the deep lines in his face, the kind that came from carrying something heavy for too many years. Finally, he spoke. You have no idea what you just walked into, do you? Her throat tightened. What does that mean? Monroe glanced around, ensuring no one was within earshot. Then, in a voice so low she had to lean in, he said, They're watching me. Her pulse jumped. Who? He exhaled sharply. People who don't like old secrets resurfacing. Karoline swallowed. And you think this flight delay has something to do with you? Monroe gave a slow, measured nod. I know it does. Silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. She shook her head. I don't get it. You're a veteran, a war hero. Why would anyone be watching you now? His jaw tightened. Because I didn't just fight in the war. I fought after it. And the things I did, the things I know, some people would rather stay buried. A prickle of unease slid down her spine. Before she could respond, a new voice cut through the conversation. Miss Leavitt. Karoline turned. Him. The man from 24A. He stood just a few feet away, his expression unreadable. I need you to come with me. Her mind barely had time to register what was happening before Monroe's hand shot out, gripping her wrist tightly. His fingers, stronger than she expected for a man his age, wrapped around her like a vice. His sharp, calculating eyes locked onto hers. Don't go with him, he muttered under his breath. Karoline's stomach twisted. The man from 24A stood just a few feet away, waiting. His expression was unreadable, not aggressive, not impatient, just certain. He wasn't a flight attendant. He wore no airline badge. He looked official, but official in a way she couldn't quite place. Miss Leavitt, he repeated, his voice calm but insistent. I need you to come with me. The first-class cabin fell into an uneasy silence. The flight attendant near the galley hesitated, then stepped forward. Sir, I need to ask why you're... The man didn't even glance at her. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a badge. Not TSA. Not airport security. Federal Aviation Administration. This is a matter of security, he stated, his eyes flicking to Monroe for the briefest second before returning to Karoline. Come with me. Please. Her breath caught. The FAA? What the hell did the FAA need with her? She glanced down at Monroe, who still hadn't let go of her wrist. His expression darkened. They're not FAA, he whispered. I've seen this before. They want something. Her pulse pounded. Was he paranoid, or was she in real danger? She didn't know what to believe, but every instinct told her this was wrong. She needed to play along, at least until she understood what was happening. Slowly, she pried Monroe's fingers from her wrist and stood. The flight attendant still looked uneasy but stepped back as Karoline followed the man toward the front of the plane. Every passenger was watching now, some whispering, others just staring as she was led through the curtain separating first class from the cockpit area. The man stopped near the flight attendant's jump seat, where another official-looking figure waited. Karoline Leavitt, the second man said, scanning her face. Do you have any knowledge of an individual on this flight named Joseph Monroe? Her pulse slammed against her ribs. The first man cut in. We believe he is in possession of classified material. Something that... He hesitated, carefully choosing his words. Something that could compromise national security. Karoline's skin went cold. What? She breathed. The second man's voice lowered. Miss Leavitt, we need you to remain calm. We believe he boarded this flight with documents that were never meant to see the light of day. She could barely process what they were saying. So why are you talking to me? The first man gave her a long, measured look. Because he trusts you. Her stomach twisted. They weren't wrong, Monroe had barely spoken to anyone else. He had locked eyes with her, pulled her into his confidence. He had chosen her. And now, these men, whoever they really were, wanted her to help them. I don't know anything, she said carefully. I gave him my seat. That's it. The second man studied her, his gaze sharp, assessing, like he was trying to determine whether she was lying. The plane jolted slightly with turbulence, and all three of them swayed. The first man's radio crackled, an urgent but muffled voice on the other end. Then, suddenly, his posture changed. He stiffened, pressing a hand to his earpiece. The color drained from his face. The second man did the same. They exchanged a quick, loaded glance. Something had changed. Without another word, they both turned and hurried toward the cockpit. Karoline stood there, heart hammering. She had no idea what had just happened, but one thing was clear: this flight was no longer just a routine trip home. Then, before she could even move, the entire plane lurched so violently that passengers screamed. It wasn't just a bump of turbulence. This was a gut-wrenching, stomach-dropping plunge that sent drinks flying and gasps ripping through the cabin. A chorus of panicked cries filled the air as overhead bins rattled and seatbelts strained against passengers' bodies. Karoline instinctively grabbed the nearest seat, her knuckles turning white as she braced herself. Her heart slammed against her ribs. Flight attendants scrambled for their jump seats, strapping in with practiced urgency. Then, the captain's voice crackled through the intercom, strained but controlled. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing unexpected turbulence. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." Karoline had been on enough flights to recognize pilot speak. This wasn't turbulence. Something was wrong. She turned sharply, trying to see where the two FAA men had gone. The cockpit door remained closed, but behind it, urgent movement flickered in the sliver of light beneath the frame. Out of the corner of her eye, Karoline saw Monroe, still as stone, hands resting on the armrests, staring straight ahead as if nothing was happening. Her pulse pounded as she pushed forward, gripping the headrests for balance. A flight attendant called after her to remain seated, but she ignored it, reaching Monroe's row and leaning in. "What the hell is happening?" she whispered. Monroe turned his head slowly, his gaze steady. "It's not turbulence. It's them." Her stomach twisted. "Who?" He exhaled. "The ones who don't want me to land." Hands clenching the seat in front of her, she barely breathed. "Listen to me," Monroe's voice sharpened. "There's something in my bag. Something they don't want you to see." She blinked. "What?" He reached down, slow, deliberate, and tapped the black carry-on beneath his seat. "You need to take it. No matter what happens." Every instinct told her to walk away, let the so-called FAA agents handle it, but the look in Monroe's eyes stopped her. It was the look of a man who knew his time was running out. Hesitating, she scanned the cabin. Passengers were tense, some murmuring prayers, others gripping armrests. The agents hadn't returned, and the cockpit remained locked. Slowly, she grabbed the bag. It was heavier than expected. She unzipped it slightly and felt her blood turn to ice. Tucked beneath neatly folded clothes was a thick, sealed envelope, stamped with the insignia of the United States government. This wasn't a war memento. This was classified. And she was holding it. Zipping the bag back up, pulse hammering, she looked at Monroe. "What is this?" she hissed. Before he could answer, the cockpit door burst open. The two FAA agents stormed back, their movements sharp and urgent. "Sir, you need to come with us." This wasn't a request. Passengers murmured, eyes wide. Monroe didn't resist, exhaling slowly as he rose, but just as he passed her, he leaned in close enough that only she could hear. "Don't trust them." And then he was gone. Just as they reached the cockpit door, the plane lurched violently. The lights flickered. A shrill alert shrieked through the cabin. Then, the oxygen masks dropped. Screams erupted. Passengers gasped, fumbling for masks, some frozen in shock. A robotic voice echoed overhead, "Please place the oxygen mask over your nose and mouth and breathe normally." But nothing about this was normal. Karoline's mind raced. The FAA agents had vanished into the cockpit with Monroe. And now, suddenly, everything was spiraling out of control. Trembling, she pulled the mask over her face, oxygen flooding her lungs, doing nothing to slow her pounding heart. She needed to think. The bag. Monroe had given it to her for a reason. It sat at her feet, unnoticed. If those agents, or whoever they really were, knew Monroe had classified documents, why hadn't they checked his bag? Why had they taken him but left behind what they were so desperate to hide? Because they hadn't expected him to pass it off. Because they hadn't expected her. Then, thud. A dull, heavy sound from the cockpit. Karoline's breath caught. Something was happening in there. Something bad. A flight attendant, fear in her wide eyes, rushed up the aisle, knocking on the cockpit door. "Captain? What's going on?" Silence. The attendants exchanged nervous glances. Then, another jolt. Not turbulence. Not weather. Something was wrong with the plane. Across the aisle, a man gripped his armrest so tightly his knuckles turned white. Karoline swallowed hard. Whatever was happening, it had just begun. "Are we going down?" the man muttered, voice shaky. Karoline refused to believe it. She turned to the flight attendant. "What's going on? Do you have communication with the cockpit?" The woman shook her head. "They're not responding." Karoline's stomach twisted. This wasn't just a malfunction. This was a hijacking. Her instinct screamed to stand up, demand answers, push through the panic and force someone to explain what was happening, but then Monroe's last words echoed in her head. "Don't trust them. Not just the agents. Anyone." Her eyes flicked to the bag. If Monroe had risked everything to get it to her, if those men had taken him without checking what he was carrying, then this was the most important thing on the plane. And if they realized she had it, she was next. Her pulse pounded as passengers fumbled with oxygen masks, voices rising in fearful murmurs. She needed time. A plan. Carefully, she reached down, pulling Monroe's bag onto her lap. The zipper was stiff, the fabric slightly worn. Inside, her fingers brushed against the sealed envelope, stamped with the insignia of the United States government. She hesitated. Opening classified documents was beyond dangerous. If she was caught, it wouldn't just be the agents after her, it would be the government. But what if this was bigger than that? What if Monroe had risked everything because what was in this bag couldn't stay hidden? Her breath hitched. There was something else inside, something metal, small, a flash drive. The envelope contained secrets on paper, but the drive? The drive was something else entirely. She barely had time to shove the bag back under her seat before the cockpit door unlocked. The first agent stepped out, alone. Monroe was gone. And for the first time, his normally unreadable face looked pale. His eyes landed on Karoline, and he started walking toward her. She had seconds to decide her next move, but before he reached her, the intercom crackled. The captain's voice returned, slow, wrong. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking." A pause. "Due to unforeseen circumstances, we will be making an unscheduled landing. Remain calm. Further instructions will be provided shortly." Karoline's breath caught. The cockpit had been locked. The pilots hadn't responded to the flight attendants. And now, suddenly, the captain was back, sounding like he was being forced to speak. The pieces snapped together. He wasn't the one talking freely. Someone else was controlling him. And Monroe was gone. She fought to keep her face neutral as the agent reached her row. He crouched, voice just above a whisper. "I need you to come with me." She shook her head. "I don't think so." His jaw tightened. "You have something that doesn't belong to you." Her pulse thundered. He knew. Monroe had told her not to trust them. That meant she had one option left. She leaned in, lowering her voice. "If I go with you, the whole plane will know something's wrong." He didn't move. She pushed further. "You want quiet. You want control. But if you drag me out of the seat, you won't have that anymore." For the first time, something flickered in his eyes, hesitation. The agent straightened, scanning the cabin. Passengers were already watching, fear clear in their faces. Flight attendants whispered nervously, on edge. And Karoline saw it. He wasn't in charge. Whoever was behind this, whoever had taken Monroe, whoever had controlled the captain, this agent was just a pawn. So she did something that went against every instinct. She relaxed, or at least pretended to. Exhaling, she nodded slightly. "I don't want trouble," she murmured. I just want to land safely. A gamble. A big one. But if he thought she wasn't a threat, he might back off. The agent studied her for a long moment, then, to her shock, he gave the smallest nod and walked away. Karoline barely had time to process what had just happened before the intercom crackled again. Only this time, the voice was different. Raw. Strained. Terrified. "This is your captain." A heavy pause. Then, through gritted teeth, "Do not land this plane." The intercom cut out. A collective gasp rippled through the cabin. Karoline's blood ran cold. The real captain had just given a direct message. Whoever had been controlling the last announcement, they weren't in charge anymore. The plane jolted again, as if fighting against an external force. Against whatever had been planned. And that's when she knew Monroe had been right. Someone had wanted him gone. Someone had wanted this plane redirected. And she was sitting on the only proof left. Her fingers tightened around Monroe's bag. She didn't know who to trust. She didn't know where this plane was about to land. But she knew one thing, whatever was on that flash drive, it was enough to get a man taken mid-flight. And that meant it was worth fighting for. Some truths aren't meant to stay buried. Some secrets are dangerous to uncover. But when the moment comes, will you choose comfort? Or will you choose the truth? If you found this story gripping, share your thoughts below. And remember, sometimes the smallest acts of kindness lead to the most unexpected consequences.